special guest, Jim Smith. Jim, former Vietnam vet, and now author of Heroes to the End. Well, welcome, Jim.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, welcome. So, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, I'd like to talk about helping homeless veterans. I am the vice president of the board of United Veterans Beacon House, a Bayshore nonprofit that runs 40 homeless shelters for veterans and others. Most of them are in Suffolk, but 4 are in Nassau. And it is the premier veterans service agency on Long Island. And I've donated $12,000 from my speaking fees and book sale proceeds to Beacon House because I believe in the mission.
Okay. So what made you be passionate about this, and what is it specifically, pertaining to the demographics of Long Island?
Well, I served from 1970 to 73 and did a year in Vietnam from August 1, 71 to August 1, 72. And when I came out, I really had 3 lost years, even though I was gainfully employed at Newsday as first general assignment reporter and then sports reporter. I had a DWI conviction. I was driving erratically. I spent a night in the tank. I was passing out with my head on my typewriter after office parties. It took 3 years until I met my wife to be in 76, and she led me out of the darkness, so to speak. And so I identify with those that have mental problems. And, at Beacon House, we don't take folks who are disabled, but we do have folks who are trying to overcome substance abuse, and they have had traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder, and some are suffering from moral injury in that they either did things or they failed to report things that they saw that were against their own moral code. And so now they are depressed, aimless, and so they need a therapy to get out of the rut, just like I needed the catalyst of meeting a good woman to break my cycle.
So tell me more about Beacon House.
So Beacon House is headquartered in Bayshore. We have about $7 million budget and 100 employees, growing all the time. Most of our homes are in residential neighborhoods. Our system works. We have various rules governing various houses depending on whether they're state, county, or federally funded. So at some locations, it's an emergency shelter. At some locations, the clients pay rent. At some locations, we handle older vets. At one location, we handle only females. So then we assign a house manager and a case manager to each house. And we have about 7 vehicles that can be used to take those who don't drive to their medical appointments and to receive counseling benefits and meds at Northport VA Medical Center. And so generally we shepherd them from homelessness to hopefully independent living.
Right. So what do you think has been the most challenging part for all those involved and getting the message out there about what's happening with our homeless vets?
Well, you know, my wife is a social worker, and we have been to countless workshops and trainings, and I have also been to meetings of clinicians to discuss the problems that veterans have. And, you know, you might wonder, how does a guy who is prompt and meets deadlines and is used to working with others as part of a team suddenly start missing his job interview appointments and, you know, seemingly needing a kick in the butt to wake up out of this lethargy that forms when one is depressed or when one is suffering from untreated PTSD. So, you know, in some cases we have to take a tough love approach and give guys a deadline and say, we don't want to hear that excuse about my wife couldn't find a babysitter and I had to watch my son. You know, you had a job interview and you blew it, you know, and your job is to get yourself employed so you can take care of your family. As far as getting out the word, I think we're doing a fairly good job because we're getting a lot of corporate sponsorship for our annual gala. We have real estate companies, we have banks, we have National Grid having, you know, job workshop days. So I think we're on the radar screen of a lot of, you know, potential donors around Long Island. But, you know, the problem just doesn't go away. And, you know, we had a problem at Northport in January. You know, it was single digits at night out there, and some of the union employees at Northport VA complained about the antiquated heating system in our emergency shelter, the one that we took over from Salvation Army a couple of years ago. And, you know, this facility is about 90 years old now. And so we had to evacuate 33 people in 72 hours and relocate them among 9 of our homes. And then some of them also were Department of Social Services clients from Suffolk that were relocated under arrangements made by DSS. So
Now, these were your personal homes that you said they were relocated to?
they were relocated to some of our shelters that are in homes in communities.
Okay, gotcha.
You know, we blend into neighborhoods, you know, without giving any addresses. I can tell you we have a couple in Huntington, one in Kings Park. We have shelters, 2 in Hempstead, one in Levittown, one in Freeport. And they're sprinkled all over Long Island, as far east as Riverhead.
Okay, wow. What do you think has been one of the most biggest highlights in all these years that's been you considered a victory for the work that you guys are doing?
Well, you know, I do a column called The Vet's View for 6 Blank Slate Media publications in North Hempstead town. And so I'm always writing about, mostly about clinicians, workshops, conferences, but I would say the biggest victory was opening a home for challenged, I'll just put it that way, veterans on Depot Road in Huntington. That was an energy efficient home. And that home was built by about 40 graduates of a program that we partner with United Way of Long Island on, called Vets Build. So it was our clients, veterans, many of whom live in our homes, building the home for 6 or 7 veterans. So that was great. I wrote one column when we broke ground, and another column when folks started to move in and we had a ribbon cutting ceremony.
That's wonderful. That's fantastic. That's great news. I also wanted to ask you, Jim, what the vets themselves, what are the things that they feel more frustrated about, and what's happening in our culture, how I feel that we don't do enough for our vets in general. I get really frustrated how they're used for political gain one way or the other, right? So I would like to hear what are some of the things that they talk about and frustrated on a day-to-day basis.
Well, I would say the biggest one is nobody cares, and the VA is slow and incompetent. In other words, they blame others for their situation. There's also a lot of young vets who are sitting in their mother's basement playing video games and not reacclimating to the culture. And that's why groups such as Team Red, White, and Blue, which I've also written about, a Long Island nonprofit, arranges social events that blend veterans with civilians. And they do service projects such as Sandy Relief in Long Beach, or a covered dish non-alcoholic dinner, and a 10K walk along the boardwalk. And it's not, and the participants mingle, they truly mingle, and people show up and give these veterans business cards. I'm personally aware of a veteran who had come to me because he thought he might want to be a writer, and I had a 48-year career at Newsday as a reporter and editor. So whenever somebody wants to be a writer that's a veteran, I get him. And I can immediately tell whether he has this stuff or he doesn't by the clips that he brings. And, this kid just didn't have it. But I was polite to him, and I gave him a few tips, and I told him he'd have to start at a small newspaper. Anyway, I followed up a few weeks later, and I found out that through a friend of a friend, he was hooked up with the sheet metal workers union in Manhattan and was working on a high-rise at that time.
Okay.
So, these are the stories you hear. Guys come out of the service and all they did was spend time as a clerk. They think they can write, but they're truly not trained for a heck of a lot. But, we have a lot of contacts, and there's a lot of businesses around Long Island that are actively recruiting veterans, and North Shore Hospital System, the largest employer on Long Island, actually has a veteran service officer whose job it is to find qualified veterans at all levels to hire for North Shore.
That's great. Oh, wow. Okay. Good. Now, tell me a little bit more about your book.
Well, when I was in the Army in Vietnam, I was 22, 23 years old, but I had spent 4 years at Newsday covering high school sports. I had also covered a Ranger playoff game and filled in on the Giants and the Knicks. So I wasn't awed. I got a job my job in Vietnam was a clerk for 5 months, and I heard about an opening at Stars and Stripes, the Army newspaper, applied for the job, and I got it. So the last 7 months I spent using helicopters as taxis and flew around the country and wrote 80 articles. And I quickly realized that only positive stories were going to be accepted and published. So I didn't write lies, but I looked for positive stories, and I found them everywhere I looked. And in my own notebooks, I have red grease pencil notations that say, "for the book." So I knew that someday I'd write this darn book, but, the deadline pressure was such in my job. I covered 5 Super Bowls, 9 Stanley Cup finals, over a 33-year period as a sports reporter. And so I never seemed to have the time to work on the book. And I tried in 1999. I went around to mainstream publishers. They weren't interested with the manuscript and proposal that I sent. So I put it on the shelf for 15 years, and I actually had to retire December 31 of 2014 before I could fully concentrate on the book. And then I wrote it in about 9 months. I rewrote a lot of the stuff from 1999, and then I decided to self-publish. So, I spent a lot of money for services to design the cover. They gave me an edit for $3,500 that I tore into a million pieces because they said chronological. I didn't want to go chronological because every memoir goes chronologically. Right. I wanted to organize it into various chapters, various subheadings like combat heroes, do-gooders, South Vietnamese units, invited guests, and that's how I did it, and I edited it myself, and so I've had 110 speaking engagements around Long Island, raised the $12,000 that I mentioned, sold 600 books, and now I'm trying to convert the book into a sexier version for a Netflix screenplay for 6 to 10 episodes, 1 season.
Right. Oh, good luck with that. And I want to know also, Jim, as far as before going to Vietnam, what were your thoughts, about the war at that time? What are your thoughts after the war? What are your thoughts now?
Well, I've gone yin-yang about 6 different times on this whole issue. When I was at Nassau Community College, I actually debated a Vietnam vet and took the pro-war side. And he was a Vietnam vet against the war who said, "I've been there, this war is unwinnable, and we better get the hell out." And meanwhile, I was saying, what about the domino theory? And if we don't beat them there, we'll have to beat them in California. But, I came out of Chaminade High School, which has had about, I think, 55 or 60 alums die in action, and it has a tradition of service. And my dad was a World War II Marine Master Sergeant, and my grandpa fought on a battleship in World War I. So I was conditioned to serve, and I went in, and of course nobody wanted to be the last guy killed, but I had conflicting thoughts even while I was there, and my letters in the back of this book reflect it. At times I was saying, you know, I'm a sellout. I'm glorifying violence and violent men. Why am I doing this, you know? And then at other times, mostly when I was sober, I would say, these guys are heroes. Their story deserves to be told. I want to stay here and see this thing excuse me, through to the end. And I actually had 2 requests to stay denied. I mean, I had a girlfriend in Saigon. I had an air-conditioned station wagon. I lived in what amounted to a small boutique hotel. I dressed in civilian clothes. I had access to French restaurants with steak and wine in Saigon. I could be in the field in the mud in the morning, and by the afternoon I could grab a shower and have a screwdriver in my hand and watch the B-52 strikes go in about a mile away from a hilltop base. And, you know, it was like as time went on, I felt like I was bulletproof. And I hung my rear end out further and further into danger the longer my tour went. Anyway, when Saigon fell in April 30th of 75, I had a traumatic episode. I locked myself in my mother's bathroom. I was bleeding out of my nose and mouth. I was pounding on the wall saying 58,000 dead for what? And, you know, I worshiped with the Quakers for a while. I joined Veterans for Peace. Then I joined the congregation, UU congregation at Shelter Rock in Manhasset, that is responsible for publication of the Pentagon Papers in book form. So I've been all over the lot as far as my thoughts on Vietnam. And, you know, the one thing, though, that I came away from it with was admiration for the people who fought it.
Well, it's an interesting perspective that you have on the whole situation. And now that you are able to, you know, do the work that you're currently doing now with Beacon House, and you know, what do you aspire? What are your hopes?
Well, my hopes that every client that we have in our shelters now could be returned to self-sufficiency and be able to support himself or herself, and at least clear some of the demons out of their minds. You know, veterans create their own prisons, and they blame themselves for things that others would view as stuff that they should not be blamed for. For instance, a tunnel rat in Cu Chi jumps into a hole with a handgun. He sees a muzzle flash and fires at it, and then he goes with the flashlight and he sees it's a female North Vietnamese soldier with a baby on her back, and the bullet went through both the woman and the baby. And so here's this guy, a Vietnam vet, a literal baby killer, the stereotype that we've all heard about, unable to move on, unable to cut himself a break. You know, there are other guys out there who faced a moment where they saw a shadow in the dark and didn't fire. And so they convinced themselves that that shadow was a Viet Cong soldier who went on to kill 10 Americans, and it's their fault that they didn't kill him. So, you know, they damn themselves if they did, and they damn themselves if they don't, and they guilt trip themselves. And, you know, I had a dose of it with survivor's guilt where, you know, I just said, there were so many heroic people, John Paul Vann among them, the senior advisor in TUCOR, that was the subject of Neil Sheehan's book, A Bright Shining Lie. A true hero. I said to myself, how did I survive and Van didn't? I was only under fire twice in rocket attacks and kind of comical situations, but scared the hell out of me, and I wound up diving in the dirt, breaking my glasses and my camera lens, and scurrying for safety, while my buddy from UPI, who didn't have his camera, was telling me, "There's your shot, take the photo of those people with the fear on their faces." And I'm like, get out of here, man. I gotta go home and be a sports reporter. I don't need this crap.
Oh, wow. Okay. And Jim, what would you want us people, what would be the message that you would want to leave with us, and how we as a community could be more supportive?
Well, just remember that each veteran is different. Everybody has a different story. And as we tell the clinicians, and hope they do, listen to the story. One size doesn't fit all. Somebody may have PTSD that was serving in the rear, that was never near the action, but he was filling out a manifest, and he was charting the people when they went to war and those who didn't return, and he was saying to himself, I killed these guys. So the mind is a terrible thing. So there are other guys in combat that seemingly came out unscathed, but know that there are Vietnam veterans today who are driving from Long Island to Brooklyn to go to group therapy for PTSD still, in some cases 50 years down the road.
Wow.
But one size doesn't fit all. Everybody is not suffering from the same malady, and just be supportive, listen, and if you can, donate to an organization that helps veterans.
Okay. Well, Jim, I just want to say thank you for being a guest today in the show and talking about something that I think it's important. Like I said, our vets, I feel like we don't do enough for them, and I'm glad that I have somebody like yourself out there, speaking for them, advocating for them, and supporting them.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me, Marcello.
You're welcome. And thanks again for another episode of, Conversation with Dr. DeSilva.
Well done, sir.